Yeah, no, fair question. I view it as a democratic reading of pragmatism, but it's certainly not the only reading even that a historian would draw, let alone a philosopher. From the beginning, I think it was clear that pragmatism could go in a variety of directions, and the examples you offer illustrate that. The figure in the contemporary world who I think is most troubling to those of us who share this democratic sensibility is Richard Posner, who is a very prolific and very prominent jurist whose writing and whose decisions treat the marketplace as the only pragmatic test that matters. And from Posner's point of view, that is a perfectly reasonable understanding of William James. It seems to me, as Harvey Cormier suggested, that a single reading of The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life would cause him to abandon the notion that this has anything to do with William James. But there has been a tradition in American social thought of readers who view the market as the only test that counts. And for those people, James can be seen as a perfect prophet of the return and triumph of the economic model. So partly what I'm intent on doing in my work is to disentangle that reading of pragmatism from my own understanding of James and Dewey and Peirce, because it seems to me that they're all moving in a very different direction, and that this constitutes, from my perspective, a bastardization of the democratic project of pragmatism. But many people have adopted these ideas, put them to a variety of uses, including the ones you mentioned, and one could go further, but I don't want to give more airtime to the people who I think are stealing rather than making good use of pragmatism.
Yes, go ahead.
Philosophical department in his lifelong quest to try to bring Peirce into it, and at least to keep Peirce on the sidelines by sponsoring lectures in Cambridge and so on. So in his own life, he certainly lived these ideas of welcoming diverse points of view, including, obviously, his relationship to Royce was a good example.
Harvey Cormier mentioned the Garrison Madden essay, William James Words and All, which was actually part of what inspired me to write my dissertation. I was so incensed by that essay. And it has long been a way of treating James. I mean, John McDermott yesterday dismissively mentioned how much James detested the Irish. I'm not sure whether it's our business as historians to judge the past. It seems to me that understanding the past is a big enough job. We have enough time judging issues in our own moment, it seems to me. But the notion that James and Wilson, about whom I've had more to say than probably most of you wanted to hear, were different from us, strikes me as true and unproblematical. I think it's striking to see what those who came after them were able to draw from their ideas that help move the culture in the direction that some of us would like to see it continue moving. But to say that James himself had already reached the kinds of social attitudes or attitudes toward race or gender that we now consider normative in the academy would be, I think, false.
Sponsorship in 1939 of Camp William James in Tunbridge, Vermont, which was the first leadership camp in the CCC. And it began as a result of Rosalind Heidekoper and Henry Copley Green's sponsorship of Huygens Rosenstock Pusey, who came and taught at Harvard and then went on to Dartmouth. And they sent Dartmouth boys and Harvard boys, among people like Page Smith and Frank Davidson, to work on Vermont farms. And as a result, Frank Davidson's connection to Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House, because his father was a New York politician, allowed him to travel around and examine the state of CCC camps where there were unregulated gangs and things. And this was an attempt of the United States government through the Roosevelt administration to start a leadership camp. And so it was started in Tunbridge, Vermont. in 1939 under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture,
right,
until FDR was attacked for allowing rich boys to be involved in the CCC, and then the war broke out and they were all drafted.
Thank you. That's fabulous. I didn't know about that. That's great.
Other questions? Yeah.
Identifies himself as a pragmatist, John Bolton. He says that you can have strong pragmatists like me or wimpy pragmatists.
Right. Yeah, the John Bolton in the Bush administration characterizes himself as a pragmatist and distinguishes his strong pragmatism from the wimpy pragmatism of, I suppose, people like me. Right. Yeah, no, this is, but I think you identified a really important theme, and it's one that we have to face, I think, as scholars of pragmatism, that the very open-endedness and embracing of experimentation and flexibility that James offered can be put to a variety of uses. And if it's not tethered by the kind of broad-minded tolerance and valuing of every individual life that have been mentioned earlier in the conference, then I think it's something genuinely dangerous. So.
Mm-hmm. And what's especially good about them is that they're defying social expectations, not necessarily that they're living up to the virtues of their society.
Right.
No one would expect this young rich white man to be leading these black soldiers. No one expected these black soldiers to take up arms and go and fight. Their individuality and their defiance of social expectations is what makes them especially admirable for him in that essay.
Right. But I think the reason that from my perspective, the reason he frames it in that way is that the fact that we're now dedicating this monument to them indicates that our cultural sensibility has been shifted as a result of their heroism. And that, I think, is the striking thing that James sees. And this, I think, you made the point yourself that there's a kind of reciprocal back and forth between the individual and the culture. And so I don't really dispute your emphasis on the individual as long as the experience of the individual is understood from the beginning to be social. There is in Principles of Psychology that discussion in which, almost anticipating later existentialists, he says there'd be no worse fate imaginable than if we were to have to live without others. Right? I mean, that would be a fate worse than death, because we depend on the validation that we receive from others, the identification that we have through the interaction we have with others. So that's the only thing I wanted to insist on, that it's not the atom independent of the others, although the volitional quality that you emphasize strikes me as fundamental to James. But the reciprocity of self and other, the interaction of self and other, of the individual and society, the ways in which the outcasts can become the heroes are, I think, what fascinate him about human history and lead him to be less drawn toward those thinkers who assume that there is some engine, whether Hegel's reason or Marx's class struggle, driving the entire process. For him, we drive it. Right. Well, I would dispute both of your premises. I don't think it was the building up of the nuclear arsenal that brought the Soviet Union to its knees. That's commonly believed on the right. I don't think it's proven. I think many historians would argue that the Soviet Union was on its way to an economic collapse long before Ronald Reagan was ever elected, and that nothing he did had an impact on those internal dynamics in the Soviet Union. Secondly, I would disagree with the premise that high taxes don't work. It seems to me that they work very well indeed from about 1943 until the late 1970s, when the gap separating the richest from the poorest Americans consistently shrank. Since 1980, that gap has consistently grown. Now, if that counts as irrelevant in what works in the economy, then the argument perhaps holds. But it seems to me there are multiple dimensions to the question of what works economically. And so the argument you make is certainly an argument that many Americans would accept, but it's not an argument that I would accept. And I would go further and say I think it's not an argument that either William James or John Dewey would accept, precisely because I think they valued the flourishing of every individual, not simply those who benefit from a particular economic system.
Let's take one more question. Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to expand a bit on the comment on the pragmatic dimension of architecture. And I'm reminded of Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright and their pragmatic mantra that form is followed function.
I wanted very much to find evidence that either of them ever expressed a debt to James, was unable to find it. There are a couple of mid-century architects named Herbert Green and, what is Gough's first name? Right now, who actually do in their work invoke James and argue that there needs to be not just form following function, but this is the part that I love, a dynamic conception of function. That your conception of function should not come either from your sense of what the school that you're part of dictates or your sense of what your aesthetic vision is, but it should come instead from an interaction between yourself as architect and your clients. And you should be trying to build in such a way that your buildings, or if you're a town planner, your town, can be adapted over time as needs change. And that's a genuinely dramatic departure from most architectural visions, I'd say including Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, where there is this kind of diva quality to the architect who transcends mere pedestrian considerations and gives us art. What Gough and Green both said and built in different ways was a kind of architecture that was designed to be, in James's sense in Pragmatism, plastic. The kind of architecture that could adapt over time to changing needs, to changing people, to changing demands. And that really was something genuinely new. There has been much less evidence of that kind of sensibility in American architecture than I expected to find, frankly. And there are a few examples of it among town planners, but not nearly as much as I had hoped. Even the new urbanists, who would seem like obvious candidates for this conception of architecture, seem to me not to have it, really. So, I mean, the idea that form follows function as a formula makes sense, but I think often in Sullivan's work, for example, it was form faking function more than it was following function. And what Gough and Green were trying to do was to take that mantra seriously and say, who's actually going to use this building for what purposes and how can it be molded over time so that it can work even better?
Before we break, I want to call on Randy Oxford to present an award. Thank you very much.
Okay.